My name is Evelyn Carter, and at 62, I believed life had finally given me a second chance. After years of loneliness following my husband's passing, I let myself fall for a man who spoke to my soul. Richard Hayes walked into my world like a promise I didn't know I was waiting for. He told me I would never be alone again, that he would fill my days with love, laughter, and security. I wanted to believe him, and for a while, I did. His charm was effortless, his attention intoxicating. He painted a picture of a future I thought was lost to me. Holidays together in Charleston, evenings by the fireplace, the comfort of not having to face the silence of an empty house. But promises have weight. They settle in the heart like anchors, pulling us deeper into a dream we hope is real. When the dream shatters, the fall is merciless. I would learn that the man who promised me the world was capable of leaving me with nothing but humiliation, heartbreak, and a truth I could never have imagined. This is the story of how I lost everything I thought I had, and how I discovered a strength I didn't know was mine. Richard Hayes was not the kind of man a woman like me expected to meet at that stage of life. He was polished, confident, and carried himself with the certainty of someone used to being noticed. I first met him at a charity dinner in Savannah, a night I almost skipped because I felt out of place among younger faces and louder laughter. Yet somehow he found me in the crowd. He spoke with an ease that disarmed me. He asked about my years as a nurse, about the husband I had lost, and even about the small garden I kept behind my house. There was no impatience in his eyes, no sign that he wished to be elsewhere. Instead, he leaned in, as though every word I said mattered. For a woman who had spent years fading into the background, that attention felt like sunlight after a long winter. When he told me, "You'll never have to feel alone again, Evelyn," I wanted to believe him, and in that moment I did. His voice carried the weight of certainty, the kind of promise that lodges itself deep in the heart before doubt has a chance to interfere. What I didn't know then was that promises can be the most dangerous lies of all, because they are the ones we choose to believe. Not long after we began seeing each other, Richard invited me to spend more time at his townhouse in Charleston. It was a grand, historic place, the kind of home with creaking wooden floors and tall windows that let in the golden southern light. He told me it needed a woman's touch, and though I laughed at the suggestion, I secretly felt proud that he wanted me there. I began adding small things almost without thinking. A vase of fresh lilies in the entryway, soft curtains in the upstairs bedroom, framed photographs of my late husband's service medals on a shelf where Richard said they belonged. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building a home again, not just living in one. Richard spoke often about the future. He painted it with broad, beautiful strokes, Christmases spent together by the fire, family gatherings where children and grandchildren would fill the rooms with laughter, vacations along the coast where we could walk hand in hand like young lovers. He made me feel as though life wasn't winding down, but beginning again. And in that house, with its high ceilings and echoing hallways, I let myself dream. I imagined holidays, birthdays, and quiet mornings that stretched into forever. I didn't see the cracks forming beneath the paint. I didn't hear the silence between his words. All I saw was a future I wanted desperately to believe in. It started with the smallest of things. A phone call he silenced when I walked into the room. A late-night meeting that had no clear explanation. A weekend business trip that appeared on his calendar without warning. Each moment seemed harmless enough on its own, but together they whispered of something I chose not to name. I told myself not to worry. After all, Richard was a busy man with responsibilities I couldn't fully understand. I convinced myself that trust meant ignoring doubts, even when they clawed quietly at the edges of my peace. He had promised me the world, hadn't he? Surely a man who spoke so boldly of forever wouldn't hide shadows behind his smile. Yet there were nights I lay awake in that grand Charleston house, listening to the hollow emptiness of the halls, Wondering why he hadn't returned yet, I noticed the faint scent of perfume on his jacket that wasn't mine, the unfamiliar names that flashed across his phone screen before disappearing. But I turned away from the evidence. I told myself it was nothing because admitting otherwise would mean facing a truth too heavy for my heart to carry. And so I chose silence. The silence of a woman afraid to lose the dream she had just begun to believe in. One afternoon, while Richard was away on another sudden trip, I decided to tidy his office. The room had always felt slightly off limits to me, with its heavy mahogany desk and neatly stacked files. But dust had begun to gather, and I wanted to leave it looking cared for, a small gesture of devotion. As I sorted through drawers, I came across a folder tucked beneath a pile of bills. At first I thought it was just another stack of business papers, but when I opened it, my breath caught. Inside were documents, unpaid debts, letters marked with urgency, and among them, a small box that seemed out of place. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid. There, hidden away as though it carried shame, was a pregnancy test. Positive. It wasn't mine. For a long moment I just stood there, staring at the word that glared up at me, the one truth I couldn't twist into an excuse. Every lie, every late-night meeting, every silenced call suddenly aligned into a picture I had refused to see. The man who had promised me forever had been living another life, a life that had no room for me. And in that instant, the foundation of my world cracked open, leaving me standing in the ruins of a dream I had once believed was real. When Richard returned that evening, I sat at the dining table waiting for him. The folder I had discovered lay closed in front of me, heavy with its secrets. I had rehearsed what I might say 100 times in my mind, but when I finally saw his face, every practiced word dissolved. I asked him directly, my voice steady, though my hands shook. "Whose is it, Richard?" I placed the small box on the table, the positive test lying inside like a silent accusation. For a moment he said nothing. His eyes darted to the box, then to me, and in that flicker of hesitation, I already knew the truth. His silence confirmed what his lips hadn't yet spoken. When he finally did respond, it wasn't with apology or shame, but with anger. His voice rose, sharp and cutting, as though I had wronged him by uncovering what he had hidden. "You were never supposed to see that," he snapped. "You wouldn't understand. You never do." I tried to steady myself. "I gave you everything I had left," I whispered. "You told me I'd never be alone again. Was any of it real?" He laughed bitterly, the sound cruel in its dismissal. "You think I needed you? You were a placeholder, Evelyn. Someone to keep the house warm, someone to look respectable at dinners. But love? Forever. Don't fool yourself." His words fell like shards of glass, each one cutting deeper than the last. I had braced myself for denial, perhaps even regret, but nothing prepared me for his contempt. He didn't just betray me, he dismantled me piece by piece, with words designed to humiliate. I wanted to scream, to throw the test in his face, to demand he acknowledged the cruelty of what he had done. Instead, I sat frozen, every muscle in my body refusing to move. My heart pounded, but my voice was gone. I was a woman staring at the ruins of everything she had believed in, unable to recognize the man who stood before her. Richard turned away, pouring himself a drink as though our life together had been nothing more than a tedious chapter in his story. "Don't make this dramatic," he muttered. "You'll survive. You always do." But in that moment I wasn't sure I would. His betrayal was one wound. His words were another, deeper still. And as I sat in that elegant Charleston townhouse, the home I thought we had built together, I realized I was utterly, devastatingly alone. That night, I retreated to the guest room at the far end of the house, the same room where I had once placed fresh flowers on the nightstand and folded blankets with quiet joy. It no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like exile. The folder lay on the dresser, its contents still inside, but I couldn't bear to look at it again. The truth it carried was already burned into my memory. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small pregnancy test in my hand, the word positive taunting me in silence. It wasn't mine, but it felt like a brand pressed against my skin. I thought of all the nights I had stayed awake waiting for him, convincing myself that trust meant patience. I thought of every promise, every touch, every word of reassurance that had lulled me into believing I was safe. And now, every memory twisted into mockery, reminding me that I had been building my hope on shifting sand. The storm outside raged as though the world itself mirrored the violence inside me. Rain streaked the windows, and lightning briefly lit the room, casting my reflection in the mirror across from the bed. I hardly recognized the woman who looked back. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes hollow, her hands trembling as they clutched the evidence of betrayal. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but who would I tell? My family had drifted away after Michael's death, and my closest friends had long since built lives of their own. Pride kept me from reaching out. Shame silenced my tongue. So I sat alone, with only the storm as witness to my unraveling. And in that quiet devastation, a single truth settled over me. Richard had not just taken my trust. He had taken the last fragile piece of myself I had dared to offer. The woman who had walked into his life full of cautious hope was gone. In her place sat a figure I did not yet know, one who would have to decide whether she would remain broken or rise from the wreckage. The next morning, I wandered through the house like a ghost. Every room felt foreign, as though I were walking through someone else's life. I found myself drawn to a cedar chest I had brought from my old home, the only piece of furniture Richard had allowed me to move without objection. Inside were fragments of a life I thought I had laid to rest. Photographs, medals, and letters from my late husband, Michael. Michael had been a soldier, a man of steady hands and steady words. He was not a poet, but his letters carried a quiet poetry born of honesty. As I opened one, the ink faded, but the handwriting firm. His voice returned to me. He had written it during his final deployment, a time when I feared each day might bring news of his death. "Evelyn," the letter began, "the world can be cruel, but you must never let it tell you what you are worth. Stand tall, even when they try to break you. You are stronger than you think, and when the storm passes, you will still be standing." I read the words over and over, my tears blurring the ink until it felt as though Michael himself was speaking through the years. In that moment, his absence hurt as much as the betrayal before me, yet his presence filled me with something I hadn't felt in days: resolve. Richard's words had sought to reduce me, to convince me I was nothing. But Michael's voice reminded me of the truth I had forgotten. I was not a placeholder. I was not a shadow. I was a woman who had endured loss, loneliness, and hardship, and survived. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it against my chest. The storm had not ended, but within me, a spark had returned. Richard might have shattered the life I thought I had, but I would not let him define what remained. In the days that followed, Richard moved about the house as if nothing had happened. He poured his drinks, answered his phone calls in hushed tones, and disappeared for hours without explanation. He no longer tried to charm me. He no longer needed to. He believed I was too broken to act, too dependent to leave. He was wrong. While he paraded his arrogance, I began to watch. I noticed the bills he left on the counter, the financial statements he carelessly discarded. Numbers told stories, and these stories were darker than he wanted anyone to know. Debts mounted, accounts dwindled, and I saw my own pension threaded through his failing ventures, like a lifeline he had quietly stolen. At first, fury threatened to consume me, but I remembered Michael's words, steady and strong. Stand tall, even when they try to break you. Rage could destroy me if I let it, but silence could be my weapon. So I gathered what Richard had underestimated, patience. Each night when he left his briefcase by the door, I went through it with careful hands. I copied receipts, photographed contracts, saved emails he thought he had deleted. Every document became a brick in the case I was building, a fortress of truth against his lies. I told no one. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches. Richard thrived on chaos, and I refused to give him the satisfaction. Instead, I became what he never imagined, invisible in my strength, deliberate in my steps. The house that once felt like a cage became my stage. Each room held evidence of his betrayal, and I collected it all. By the time I was done, I knew more about his life than he realized. And with every discovery, my fear weakened, replaced by something sharper, something colder. I wasn't simply preparing to leave him. I was preparing to strip away the empire he had built on my trust. He had promised me the world, but he would learn that the woman he dismissed as a placeholder could take that world back, piece by piece, without ever raising her voice. The day of the hearing arrived with the weight of finality. I dressed carefully, not in extravagance, but in quiet dignity. A navy suit that had once belonged to my late husband's uniform collection, altered to fit me. I wanted strength stitched into every seam. When I entered the courthouse, Richard was already there. He stood tall, smiling with the confidence of a man convinced the world still bent to his will. His lawyer whispered at his side, and Richard glanced at me with the smirk of someone certain I would crumble before the first word was spoken. But I did not crumble. My attorney opened the folder we had built together. The receipts, the bank transfers, the forged signatures, the undeniable trail of theft and deceit. Each page landed on the judge's desk like a hammer. I watched Richard's smile falter, his posture shift, his jaw tighten as the evidence stacked higher and higher. When he finally spoke, it was with indignation. He painted me as an old, bitter woman clinging to scraps of affection, desperate to ruin him out of spite. He raised his voice, pacing the floor, as though volume could bury the truth. But the judge was unmoved. His words fell into the silence of disbelief, every excuse thinner than the one before. Then it was my turn. I rose slowly, my hands steady on the table. I spoke not with rage, but with clarity. I told the court about the promises, the lies, the way my savings had been siphoned without my knowledge. I spoke of trust betrayed, of a future stolen, and of the strength I found in silence. My voice did not tremble. For the first time in months, I felt whole again. When the ruling came, it was swift and decisive. Richard's accounts were frozen, his access to my pension cut off, his schemes laid bare for the world to see. The man who had promised me the world now stood stripped of his illusions, powerless against the truth. As the gavel struck, Richard turned toward me, his eyes burning with fury. But I did not look away. I met his gaze calmly, the way you face a storm that has finally spent its rage. The morning after the ruling, I stood in the doorway of the Charleston townhouse for the last time. The house was quiet, stripped of the illusions I had once hung like curtains across its windows. The walls, once filled with promises, now echoed only with truth. I carried a single suitcase. It wasn't heavy. Most of what I had brought into Richard's world had already been taken back. The photographs of Michael, the letters that had carried me through the darkest years, the small tokens of a life lived with integrity. Everything else I left behind. As I stepped outside, the air was cool and clean, tinged with the scent of salt drifting from the nearby harbor. The first light of dawn spread across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. For months I had woken in shadows, waiting for betrayal to reveal its next face. But now, the day broke open with the quiet promise of freedom. I paused at the gate and looked back once, not with regret, not even with longing, but with a strange calmness. That house had been both a dream and a prison. and like all prisons, it had taught me something. Survival is not about what you're given, but what you choose to reclaim. I walked down the street without rushing, suitcase in hand, my steps steady. Each one carried me farther from the woman who had believed in Richard's lies, and closer to the woman I was becoming, someone no betrayal could ever define again. The city stirred awake around me, but for the first time in a long time, I did not feel small within it. I felt present, I felt free, and as the sun lifted higher over the rooftops, I whispered to myself words stronger than any Richard had ever spoken. This dawn belongs to me. Months have passed since I closed the door on that chapter of my life. At first I feared the silence would consume me, that I would be haunted by Richard's words, by the betrayal etched into my memory. But silence, I've learned, is not always an enemy. Sometimes it is the ground where strength takes root. I have rebuilt my days slowly, piece by piece. Morning walks through the park, afternoons spent volunteering at the local clinic, offering comfort to those who feel forgotten. Evenings with books, letters, and the quiet company of memories that no longer weigh me down but lift me up. Richard's promises once held me captive, but I no longer measure my worth by what was promised or withheld. I measure it by the strength I discovered when everything fell apart. I thought betrayal had broken me, but it carved a space inside me for resilience, dignity, and freedom. Sometimes I still hear his words, the cruel ones meant to reduce me, but they no longer cut as they once did. They remind me of a truth I had forgotten. No one, no matter how charming or ruthless, can take away the essence of who I am. This is not the story of a woman abandoned with nothing. This is the story of a woman who rose from ruins, who walked into the dawn, carrying not shame, but strength. And if there is one lesson I carry with me, it is this. The promises others make can vanish, but the promise we make to ourselves, to endure, to rise, to reclaim our worth, is the one that will always remain.